So, good morning, everyone. My name is Neha Sami. I'm one of the faculty here at IIHS, and I'm really excited to open the session with a panel that kind of brings together folks who think differently and write differently, but focusing particularly on moving kind of academic writing away from an audience of just academics to a broader group of people. So we have a really exciting group of people from very different backgrounds here with us today. We'll open with Professor Gundur, who is a professor at the Department of Studies and Research in English at Tumkur University. He is a bilingual writer, and his areas of research interest include literary and critical theory, European philosophy, liberal education, Kannada literary and cultural studies. Professor Gundur has translated Michel Foucault's writings into Kannada. Besides being the author of Vartamandana, Itihasakara, did I say it right? Okay. He has written in scholarly journals including EPW and in Kannada dailies such as Prajavani. Padmini Remare, who will go next, is the course leader for the MA in Digital Humanities, as well as teaches a different range of courses at Srishti, just down the road from us here. Padmini's work has been published in a range of peer-reviewed journals and edited collections across a wide range of disciplines, and she's received significant funding on several occasions to help develop her research. She's currently also Vice Chair of Global Outlook Digital Humanities, the Editor-in-Chief of the SHARP, Society for History of Authorship, Reading and Publishing newsletter, and the Managing Director of DH Commons. Kaveri Gill is Associate Professor, Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at Shiv Nadar University. She has published widely, including a monograph with Oxford University Press of poverty and plastic scavenging and scrap trading entrepreneurs in India's urban informal economy. And you'll also see her in another panel later in CityScripts. Her research interests include the political economy of urbanization, development informality, and the environment, inequality and social policy for development policies and the status of Adivasis in mainland India, and the political economy of public health policy and practice. And finally, we'll close with Aromar Revi, who is the director of IIHS. He is one of the world's leading experts on global environmental change, especially climate change. He is the coordinating lead author of the 2018 IPCC Special Report on global warming of 1.5 degrees C that will define potential implementation pathways for the Paris Climate Accord. He is also the editor of the journal Urbanization that IIHS publishes with SAGE and aims to publish comparative and collaborative global interdisciplinary scholarship to illuminate the global urban condition, particularly rooted in the global south. So we'll start with Professor Gundur. Each of the panelists will speak for about 7 to 10 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for a discussion.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank Indian Institute for Human Settlements and Rekha and her team for inviting me to share my experience as an academic writer. First of all, I'm very uncomfortable because I'm a professor teaching in a government university. I need a huge classroom and a lectern, and I'm sitting here. And that too, I don't come out of my class before 1 hour. If I come early, it is 1 hour, but I have to make my point just within 7 minutes, I think. We professors need, 15 minutes to warm up. So anyway, I will make a couple of quick points. We are in the age of fast food, although humanities teaches us to be slow. But anyway, the first point I would like to make is, since the theme of this panel or this festival is writing the city, and basically I practice academic writing. In my opinion, I was just reflecting upon this academic writing. There is a close connection between the urban life and academic writing, I think. From the beginning, you take the example of Athens. Our great Aristotle left Stagira and came to Athens in search of academic life. And although he himself did not write politics, but it is the product of Athens as an urban space, I think. That's where our journey begins. Academic writing in the sense we call today and we practice in universities. There are different forms of academic writings, maybe coming from different cultures, from our own Sanskrit tradition. That's a different thing. But academic writing, in the sense we call today, is basically an urban phenomenon, in my opinion. The great cities have produced great academic, intellectual or scholarly writing. So, academic writing, in this sense, is basically one of the most important contributions of the Western civilization, I think. What we practice in the name of academic writing comes from a particular culture. The way we write, including the citation, they are all developed in basically European intellectual climate, and this is an important point for the non-Western civilizations or non-Western cultures, because this is where there is what scholars like Robert Philipson, Suresh Kanagaraja talk about something called geopolitics of academic writing. The best journals and the best practices of academic writing, they come from the first world, Europe, America, and although we are sometimes our thinking is better, our writing is not reflected in those journals and in those publishers, basically. So we need to understand, this is an occasion to think about the geopolitics of academic writing. Once what happened, I wrote a short piece and sent it to Professor Catherine Belsey, professor of critical theory, and she gave a lot of counsel and told me, your name is not heard here, so probably you will not be published in journals like Critical Quarterly. So this is something we need to think about, the geopolitics of academic writing. And then this also has some implications because Rekha told me that I need to speak something about what kind of academic writing is taking place in bhashas. For example, in Kannada, I am associated with our Tumkur University journal called Lokadhyana, and by Kannadigas it is recognized as one of the best academic journals. And also I write in Kannada for some periodicals like Prajavani. So the problem is again this since this is an outsider's practice, in the larger sense, still in bhashas it is difficult for us to make sense of what it means to write academically. That is why we are still outsiders to this practice. For example, just to give an example, we don't have the proper style sheet, for academic writing in bhashas. Although Hampi University, they have produced some manual, I have heard, I haven't seen, but I found a lot of discrepancies, a lot of problems with this. To give a very simple and silly example, I'm not talking about argumentation level and framing and all these things. For example, a Kannada writing makes use of some English text. Those English texts should be written in English, or for example, Edward Said Orientalism, or in Kannada script. Is one problem for me. So there are, just to give one example, so we need to think about the geopolitics of academic writing and the role of academic writing in bhashas. Okay, and of late I have been thinking about, as an academic, when we write, we basically make use of intellectual concepts, frameworks that come from the West. We have to make use of them. No, we can't reject them, but at the same time, we can explore the alternative ways of doing academics using Indian concepts. For example, in Sanskrit tradition, we have a Vagvada tradition, and there is something called Purva Paksha. How Indian academics dealt with Purva Paksha, what kind of argumentation, even Indian logic is there, Buddhist epistemology is there. Have we explored these things and made them part of Indian academic writing is something I would like to raise this question. And last one point, okay, one point that is, generally there is a tendency to look at academic writing as something, it's a prose, conceptual writing, argumentative writing, but we often fail to look at academic writing as a form of narrative. For me, academic writing is as powerful a narrative as any fictional writing. Looking at academic writing as a narrative, is important for us because that leads us to do a lot of experiments with the academic writing. You can find a lot of experiments in fictional writing because it is seen as a narrative. You can experiment with narratives. So we don't look at academic writing as a narrative. If you look at academic writing as a narrative, see, probably we can go for some experiments. Experiments generally take place in creative writing. That's why I would like to cite, recently I worked on Michel Foucault. Look at Foucault's writing. He begins with some, it's a mixture of, journalistic kind of writing sometimes. That's why in one of his interviews he calls his writing fiction. Recently there is one bestseller, two bestsellers by Yuval Noah Harari, Sapiens. And I think if I have to write as an academic today, I think I should write like him. And the last point is how to take this academic writing to the larger audience. I think we academics have two responsibilities. One, to write for the specialized journals, and second, we increasingly should contribute op-eds to newspapers and etc. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello? Yes, okay. Right, thanks. Thank you so much. Professor Gundur, I think that you really set the scene for what I was going to say, so I'm very glad that you talked about or started talking about the geopolitics of academic publishing. So I kind of am here from kind of 4 different perspectives really. So I worked for Edinburgh University Press for a couple of years in the UK, and I've worked for mainstream publishers as well. I used to teach publishing studies while I was in the UK, so I have a kind of an insight into what it means to be an academic publisher and think about publishing, and of course as an academic working here. And so obviously the challenges between the two environments have been different. But clearly there is, as you mentioned, Professor Gundur, there's a clear bias towards academic work that comes from familiar names, from familiar universities. And I think one of the largest reasons for this is just the way by which we map the academic career, right? So, in the US, I think that's defined by, say, tenure, in the UK by, the exigencies of, a permanent position, which are all predicated on, you have a number of publications in a peer-reviewed journal, you have your monograph. So there are all of these stepping stones that we as academics are expected to kind of, fulfill in order to get ahead as academics. And I think, sadly, that creates a tension between, making knowledge and disseminating knowledge for purposes other than the academic rat race, to be honest. And I feel that a lot of younger scholars who are now increasingly feeling comfortable with disseminating their work in digital spaces are often challenged because they feel that they would like to be recognized for that kind of work, but we don't have the frameworks here or even abroad to kind of legitimize those forms of writing, which might be as critically rigorous, but is treated as less serious because it's not, an imprint of a university press say in the West, or published by, you know, Sage or Taylor and Francis. And of course, the irony is that, you know, publishers like Taylor and Francis are constantly locking scholars from the global South out. I received an email a couple of months ago requesting me to help them with their strategy in the global South, and they kind of made this offer of largesse, which would allow scholars from the global South, which was also a slightly kind of generic term, I don't know, you know, how they were defining the global South, to access all Taylor and Francis content for 1 month a year. And clearly, I mean, that's clearly a way of, you know, selling their material and basically saying, well, you know, if you experience the riches of Taylor and Francis, you will invest and, you know, buy these kind of journals for your library, etc. But the reality is, and even Robert Darnton, who is the head librarian at Harvard, has said that we cannot afford journals. I mean, it is an excruciatingly, and getting to become an excruciatingly expensive undertaking in a scenario where higher education is increasingly crunched by funding. You know, what's more is that these publishers are making something like 400% profit. So as an academic, and those of you who are academics will know that our recompense for this kind of labor is never financial, and that's fine, because the kind of assumption is that we get kind of paid in promotion or in recognition. But if we can't, as scholars from the global South, even intervene or even kind of intercept those categories, then it's incredibly difficult to be legitimized or to be recognized in those terms. Another thing that I wanted to mention, so I run the program in digital humanities at Shishti, so my interests are around kind of knowledge making in the digital space and how we disseminate knowledge. And I think one other huge disadvantage that we have, especially in promoting Indian language content, is that the bias of kind of the Western educational kind of even at an infrastructural level is baked into the internet, right? So, you know, metadata, for example, so the data around data, what we use to search material on the web is overwhelmingly in English. So if I want to, you know, kind of find content that Professor Gundur has written in Kannada, that is incredibly difficult. And I think that in itself immediately makes invisible large parts of knowledge that, you know, we should be prioritizing in our own work. And this, of course, requires a kind of on almost kind of rebuilding or kind of from the ground up of the infrastructures that underlie kind of digital spaces in order to make sure that these become kind of accessible and visible in things like search. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is something that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is, you know, the kind of the practice we have of photocopying, or now, I guess, scanning content. And there was a famous Rameshwari photocopy shop case in Delhi, as some of you might know, which, you know, I'm so glad that we won it, because it kind of sends a message and sets a precedent for the way that we think about academic knowledge in this country. Because I think, you know, academic publishing, as you said, Professor Gundur, I mean, not only is it kind of built around Western conceptual frameworks, the kind of the business of it is a Western import as well, right? I mean, you know, Oxford University Press kind of has been here for the last 200 years, and, you know, they made much of their wealth based on the Indian textbook market. So, you know, I think the fact that we've got new texts, for example, in Delhi, and even some of the work that Arpita Das has been doing with Yoda Press, this kind of push towards putting academic work out for free or close to free is incredibly important, incredibly essential in a country where, you know, an academic book, even with the special pricing for India, can cost, you know, students' fees for a month. You know, and it's incredibly necessary. But what that means is that once we kind of open up these means of publishing, we have to have structures in place that legitimize them, so that you know, academics can feel maybe more comfortable and more inclined to be working in this space. And I'm actually speaking on the next panel about Wikipedia and its contribution to knowledge. And again, we found that there's very, very little contribution of academics from higher education writing on Wikipedia, which is an interesting kind of dichotomy, because if we're interested in our knowledge kind of being, reaching a wider audience, then Wikipedia should be, one of the places to start. And I'd just like to end by saying that, so I'm Bengali speaking, and I think one thing that I found, but definitely I hear that this is the case in Kannada, in Marathi, in Malayalam, is that much of the fantastic intellectual work that has been done in in knowledge and the creation of knowledge has been through the little magazine, has been through journals, informal, for the intellectual interested reader. And I think it's a great shame that we still don't have the processes in place to make those digitized, searchable, and to add to the libraries that say our students are accessing when they're going online. So I'll just leave that there.
Wonderful. So thank you to IIHS for inviting me, Richa, Neha, Gautam, and a lot of friends and colleagues. It's just lovely to be here, and what a lovely building and place. And so my co-panelists have set the stage. So I am going to speak because this panel is looking at writing as a form of knowledge production. So I thought I would go into it from a very particular lens, and that is really through the lens of the monograph that came out of my PhD. So it's 20 years now. 20 years ago I started the field work. It dates me. And next year will be 10 years that this book is out, and so in a way it's an apt moment to reflect. It's called Of Poverty and Plastic, and it came out with OUP. And I was very excited to receive this invite, because I think form as critical lens, and writing in particular, writing is something I love, and I often have thought that if it wasn't as an academic, how else one would engage in this endeavor. So I'm taking this panel to really explore that question more narrowly, so I'm not going to talk about many other things that both my previous panelists have raised and that are very relevant. So I think the things that set apart this writing this monograph, and I want to go into, the next part will really apply to if there are any students here or people who have sort of engaged in in-depth research, is really that sort of depth of engagement that went into it, So in a way it was 10 years from the field to the book, with the PhD in the middle. What this form allowed me to do is really to take the question of interdisciplinarity. We speak about that often, it's a buzzword, but the fact is that even today, whether it's in India or anywhere in the world, there are very few spaces for true interdisciplinarity within academia or without. So the form of a book kind of allows you to engage with that question in a way that perhaps is not possible, when you're going into journals or other kinds of mediums. And this question of marrying theory and praxis, again taken to a certain degree, what are the tensions involved? What are the questions critical? The city as a site, it's a lovely question in a way. I think my experience that, both cross-sectionally, what I saw of the very same city that I supposedly had been living in on and off for a large chunk of my life, as well as longitudinally, I look back 20 years down the road at that very, location, and this kind of form, shape-shifting, and this kind of, multi-dimensional experience that the researcher goes through is, something quite incredible. And then something that, Solly isn't here, but informality as a subject. So I think here, the questions that came up, and that's something I've also thought about when I talk to researchers today about, researching the informal, is really questions about relationships, about trust, about, very long engagement, so the question of time. Doing field economics, the power, the asymmetry, but in a way something that also gets flattened out the more you engage. And then of course the ethics of it, we are all familiar, but in this case, what came out, there was a public interest litigation. It's a sad fact that I could do nothing in it, though I tried. But what is the ethics? Those are the kinds of questions. And coming to, academic writing being different, so we were asked to reflect on why academic writing is different from other kinds of writing. And so I'd first like to start with writing per se. And I think here, for somebody like me, I used to stammer as a child and I hated public speaking. And I was thinking about this, that writing, in a way, it's solitary, there's space for reflection, craft, for creativity, and in many ways it's quite removed, so you don't need to engage beyond the point, in a very, in a manner that might have to in some other mediums. And then, of course, as many of us here might know, I think writing gives a lot of pleasure as much as it does a lot of pain. It's a painful process. It's very up and down, by its very nature. But ultimately, when I look back, I think that, anytime I've engaged in serious writing, that's really been a kind of a meaningful contribution, not in a heavy, poncy way that I'm saying that. But seriously, so much other stuff that one does just disappears. And I think writing in that sense, sort of, there's a mark. Coming to academic writing, and particularly as I'm focusing on the monograph format here, I would say that one needs the discipline of, Maria Rilke's long distance runner. That's what it is. And we heard from the previous speakers, citation, evidence heavy, sometimes one would really fantasize as a PhD student or whatever of getting away from that all and the ability to free flow like travel writing or something else, which is, is lovely. And then, of course, the rules of publishers, publishing, to whatever degree, sentence length, tone, limits, all of that comes into play. But again, I would stress that, the way that a book allows you to tell a complete story is something that other forms don't perhaps, allow. And then the psychology of academic writing. I don't know about others, but I would say, we often heard, and it's true, that writing is thinking. So somewhere just that persistent regularity, like keeping a diary, a puzzle that falls into place somewhere at the end, and small tricks like stopping, where you, at a good place, where it's easy to pick up. And I think the perfection is the enemy of the good enough. I speak to a lot of people now who really hesitate about publishing their PhD as a book, and I really do feel that, there does come a point where you've lost complete objectivity, you're reading that material, but you're really blind to it. I would say just go for it, because in a way, the PhD is like Hotel California. You get in and there's only one exit. But for the postdoc and the book, the psychology, I told myself that it's a voluntary activity. It's very much something I don't need to do, but I am doing it because so those kind of tricks, and as I say, don't not do it because of finding it daunting, and don't put it off because life takes over. And I think, finally, experiences of taking it to a wider audience, I really don't know, because in a way, my experience was, it's like putting a paper boat in a river. You just don't know where it's going to end up, who is going to read it in a kind of a small lit corner of a dark library, where and when. It's something you just put out, and then it takes a life of its own. My one regret, if I had, looking back, I didn't think this book was going to have such a long life or such a journey, but I may have anonymized the location. I've thought about that in the context of, informality, existence, and, the PIL and all those kinds of things. But, that's about it, and I hope to write other books, but I know I'll never write another one such as this one. It was a moment in time, and thank you for inviting me.
Pick up from that rather wide and expansive discussion, and maybe a slightly different sort of viewpoint, because I'll talk a lot about science, at least in this latter part of what I'm going to say. But first, some reflections on, let's say, our institutional position and why we're here, and why a sort of academic institution will be really wanting to engage very strongly with academic writing. That's what we do in some senses, but also with questions of creative writing and literature. So three things. The first thing is, I think what we're trying to do here, and I think we're succeeding in a small measure, is to establish one of the epicenters of what I would call southernization. We talked a lot about westernization and this back and forth. There's a big cultural debate in this country about that. But it's southernization in a global context, because even in large hegemonic cities like London and New York, you find lots of poor people living on the streets, which we're familiar with, but that's part of that process. So in some senses, we're trying to establish a place like this in our country in the global south. And the reason in some ways is very simple, that when we're talking about cities and urbanization, this is where it's actually happening. So, the world is shifting and pivoting around this thing, whether it's in China or in South Asia or Africa or Latin America. This is where it's happening. So reflections from both practice and theory building on this is, in a sense, the way the world is going. The question, of course, like you said, is that the current structures are organized in a historical frame which starts with the 18th, well, actually with the Renaissance, the Western Renaissance. It sort of missed us in some ways. For good reason, and maybe it's a good opportunity to do things. So we're working within that frame, because modernization is really situated in that context, and we're struggling with it in some senses. But the reality is very different. And I think the interesting challenge for both academic writing and practice is to make those linkages and pivot around our own cultures. So in a sense, we're building an institution, sort of an interdisciplinary institution that's doing that. And in doing that, we're struggling with one very interesting question, and that is, what would the 21st century digital university press look like? So if you were to try and build that process, which Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard, etc., started a few hundred years ago, what would it look like? And I think these conversations are helping us trying to get our head around that question. Is it necessary? Is it a collective endeavor of a whole range of institutions? Is it one set of institutions that does it or not? But I think there's very, very critically, there's a very important space for that, and I think our colleagues, especially here from the Word Lab, are trying and build that kind of precursor. So that's sort of the sort of first provocation. The second thing is, for us in this country, one of the most significant challenges, apart from gender, caste, etc., in terms of asymmetry and exclusion, is around language. And if, like you were saying, if the bhashas don't actually have a space of their own to be able to reflect, and even within the subcontinent to actually contest and co-create, you're going to have really, sort of reactionary cultural responses. We have to create the space for that. And we've been struggling for that in our teaching and learning, because our environments, whether it's people who speak Kannada or Urdu or Hindi, or all of us who speak multiple languages, how do you sort of create original thinking, even with respect to very sort of pragmatic things, like the work Kaveri has done on solid waste. The way that you actually look at it is deeply determined by the language that you have and the cultural processes and practices. So addressing language questions and doing that at scale, I mean really at scale. As an institution, we produce maybe 10-20,000 pages of text. So how do you actually make that available to lakhs of people across multiple languages? And how do you build the infrastructure to make that happen? Which in some senses the Indian state should have done, and we have those mechanisms, but it actually hasn't happened. And it's getting more and more fragmented, is a core question that we're talking about. So, when we talk about connecting academic writing in the city, it really is to try and address very real problems. If you can't address innovation that's happening in one part of India and take it to another part of India, which involves language, context, theory building, etc., then you're not able to deal with the lived reality, and obviously you're not able to deal with the more abstract questions. So building that infrastructure, building that discourse and that process is something that we're working with quite actively here, and we're welcoming as many people inside. We had a translation conclave a few months back to try and really bring together language publishers, translators, people working on machine learning, try and understand how we can take this forward. Because in some senses the Indian state has kind of failed us in this project, and obviously then citizens, whether it comes through Wikipedia or that kind of route or otherwise, have to pick that up and sort of run with that. So that's a context, but within that, and I certainly share the concern that the Western tradition, which we now have completely institutionalized thanks to UGC and a whole range of other things, into this API framework, which is kind of it's going to be the death knell of whatever we have in Indian academia at the current point of time. We've done it without even thinking about what's happening. It's actually going to degrade Indian scholarship more than it actually has, which essentially puts the peer-reviewed journal and the whole rat race of academic progression which came from a very, well, I would say a Fordist view of how our knowledge is created, at the center of trying to move our gross enrollment ratios from 20 to 30 to 40%. It's a severe challenge. So the question is, for many of us who are trying to look at it, one thing of course is, some academics break out of that tradition by writing in bhasha. They do break out of that tradition by writing in a whole range of other media, whether it's newspapers in one end to blogs, and of course now on Twitter also. So a whole range of things in social media. So people are breaking out of that. They're resisting the attempt to try and force their professional and public lives into certain boxes, which are really, really problematic, because often it means livelihood access and stuff like that. A few of us, and this institution especially, we really see publishing as important, but a very small part of the life of people's doing things. But since progression as an institution otherwise is tied to that, we have to find ways around that. And one of the ways that we tried to find around that is actually to set up our own journal. So in a sense, you could count it as an act of resistance, that after 20 or 30 years, I have it here, you can see it, we produced after 30 years, there's the first journal that's come from the Global South that is for writing for professionals and academics from the Global South about the Global South. So it was a big thing in some senses. A lot of people said, oh, this is whatever it is. But there's a politics to the process which we're trying to play intelligently. The first thing is that you pick a fairly well-known publisher. So this is Sage, and I think we've had a very interesting relationship with Sage in the fact that they've actually enabled open access to the publication for a number of years, which is actually a very big step in addressing the question of access. Of course, in our context, I think it's it's the obvious thing to do. And as e-publishing produces, the journal business or at least the publishing business is going to be disintermediated. And that will change, and we can see that certainly in the hegemonic sciences, in physics, in neurosciences, etc., much of the real cutting edge stuff has gone out. But the other interesting thing is, once you've picked a journal, a publisher which translates across the world both electronically and otherwise, the critical thing then is to organize your structure so that it signals certain things. So if you look at our editorial board, for example, and our sort of advisory board, it actually picks and has maybe 20, 30 of the leading academics in the world in it, okay, from all the top universities in the world. So they're also signaling that they think what's happening in so-called Global South, what I call the epicenter of the urban revolution in some senses, as something that's important. And that changes the organization. And as you bring those people through, we had colleagues over here in our research conference about a month or so ago, it starts changing the way that young scholars and even older people try looking at the process. So we have articles now pretty much from across the world. We have stuff, when we're talking about the Global South, we have stuff on the US or on UK reflecting on their condition. And I think that pivot is the interesting thing that we have to do. Obviously, the challenge for us is this is an English language journal, because this is the language of scholarship across the world. But as we expand, trying to bring in literature from Spanish, which is quite important in the urban space, later in Chinese, and eventually to make this kind of stuff, even if it's just simple abstracts that you translate in other languages in a digital format, will be actually very interesting. So in some senses, the journal itself or establishing these journals is quite important. But what we try and sort of, and I'm not sure we're fully successful in this, encourage our colleagues to do is two things. One is that you must publish internationally, because it's important to do that. That's how your voice gets heard, and you actually contest this framework, number one. The second thing is you do need to publish in Indian journals, because that's the only way to strengthen Indian publishing. The question is, how do you translate those two things out without becoming a slave of academic labor? So that you have things in both, in both those things. So I would, so setting up and establishing journals, I think is an important part of that engagement, and collective infrastructure that enables us to do it is quite important. So having said that, I'll switch to something which is quite different, and that is, how does one participate in what I will call high level hegemonic processes? Because if you don't participate in those processes, you don't actually build both the confidence and the ability to contest in these spaces. And the example that I'm going to take is, this comes from Cambridge, so you can see it. It's one of those. This is one of 6 volumes. So it's meant to kill small animals. But this is, in a sense, this is the last cycle. This is one of the 6 volumes of the. I know you heard about it. It's a science thing. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which basically does work on climate change. This is a global report that's produced every 7 years. And this is, in a sense, the highest science that you can find in the world in a given space, whatever. So how does it actually work? And it's important to understand that in some senses. The first thing that one has to understand is that, unlike many other things, this is a very special process. This brings together scientists from across the world. Fine. So this is one of the most significant challenges the world is facing at the current point of time. About 30 years ago, a set of Western scientists got together, said it was important, and said that we have to bring together scientific evidence to establish this. And even today, you have a lot of people, including leaders of some countries, who believe that climate change is not happening. I mean, you have to look around and you have to see that it's actually happening to even cities like Bangalore. So they built a very unique institution, which, if you talk to other colleagues in the UN, the thing that they say is this is the cheapest bang for the buck that the UN system has ever got. Why? Because everybody in this, and they're about every cycle, we're running the new cycle just now of 7 years, which started 2 years ago. There are about 2,500 scientists from across the world who participate in this process. They spend 7 years, some of them, or 5 years doing this, and they do it entirely for free. Okay, so there's no research funding for it. There's nothing excepting for what their institutions give, and sometimes their governments or whatever it is, somebody else funds their travels for meetings in between. So it's entirely a sort of collective labor of love for free, and that's the beauty of high quality academic work. That people do that for free. They do it because they're interested in knowledge, they're interested in their students, they're interested in furthering an engagement to the particular question. The challenge, of course, is that in our country or even otherwise, it's very difficult for us, and we try and do this kind of stuff, to assemble the same kind of process to address the questions that we have in our own country. So what is the process? There's the process of nomination, which every government across the world, 93 of them, they nominate their leading scientists to be part of this process. It's a very complex process involving various kinds of things that are there. Till very recently, the only people who could nominate scientists into this process were governments. That changed in this cycle. So, for example, we as an institution are, apart from the government of India, the only other nominating institution in India. So we can nominate people from outside. And there are many issues with that, because government prefers certain kinds of scientists and doesn't necessarily prefer other kinds of scientists. So there's a politics in that process. So you get nominated. Then there's a massive process which involves, out of a selection pool of about 5 or 10,000 people, to boil this down to the few hundred people who are actually going to do this thing, which is very interesting. There's a politics to it also, but the fact is that over time the IPCC has learned how to deal with a whole range of asymmetries. So, for example, there are balances of which region you come from. So the authors, because it's a global process, and if you come from, you have to have somebody coming from a small island state like Fiji or the Maldives, because those are the people who are going to go under. And if you don't have that, then the negotiation fails. Okay, you obviously have to have India and China and Saudi Arabia or Russia, because they're the people who are creating the problem by taking the oil out and whatever it is. So you basically have to have regional representation. The new thing that's happened, I guess, over the last 15 years is that there is an implicit, or rather, there's an explicit gender balance that the teams try to enable. So this is a big change. The chapter that I lead just now actually has a moderately good gender balance. And you can see that older scientists are not winning women in current science. They're less. I mean, they're more women than otherwise, and that completely changes the dynamics. Similarly, you try and balance across disciplines. So for the first time in this cycle, we have archaeologists. I have a chapter where I have behavioral scientists inside this kind of stuff. So coming from really hard science with a lot of physicists and chemists and stuff like that, we're moving into a new space. So there's a politics of selecting who the authors would be like. And then the authors have to go on and actually undertake, I think, one of the most dramatic tasks that is done by current science, and that's a good part of sciences. We have to assess over a period of time all the relevant literature there is to answer a few science questions. Okay? So in the chapter that we're just finishing this now, it's under review, we have 50 pages printed. That chapter has 1,700 citations. Okay? So I'm just giving you the other end of it. So this is the upper end of science. This is the power of global science coming together. It's just 50 pages long. So it's about, whatever it is, it's about 45,000 words in terms of length, but there's 1,700 citations. So just managing the process of managing the citations is a critical task. We have 2 people, young scholars, who are actually managing that process. Yeah. And the interesting thing is, and this is, I would say, the high end of what peer review literature does, is this process goes through 3 sets of reviews. You first do a draft, and that's reviewed by people inside the IPCC. It's called a friendly review. The second thing that happens is it goes out to experts, and the experts comment on it. The process of expert review, unlike a journal article, is completely open. Okay, fine, which basically means we've got these, whatever it is, 50 pages that we write, and then in the first cycle that we had 5,000 comments on those 50 pages. So there's literally a comment for pretty much every line in that text, fine. But the process of review is that you have to, the authors collectively have to actually respond to those comments and say it's not relevant or it's X, Y, and Z, and that becomes public. Okay. After that's done, it goes into a second review which has both experts and governments. So this is going to come out at the end of the month. I'm expecting that we'll have about 8,000 comments that we get, or maybe 10,000 comments on this single chapter. So at the end of the exercise, we would have reviewed 15,000 comments on a 50-page piece of text, probably put together about 2,000 different citations from literature which is about maybe 7, 8, 10,000 citations together. And that would give you, in a sense, the state of the art as far as this question is concerned. So the question we're trying to address is, can the Paris Climate Accord be implemented? Can it be implemented or not? And if it were possible to implement it, how would you do it? That's the question we're trying to answer, with lots of sub questions and various other kind of things that are there. So the reason I'm laying this out in some detail is, in the narrative, one of the critical things that we're saying, which was not said about 10 years ago, was that cities are absolutely central to this happening. Why? Because cities produce much of the carbon emissions that we have, because we have cars and buildings and air conditioning and stuff like that. But also, on the other hand, the most vulnerable places in the world are cities. And you can see that whether it's Bangalore not having water, or Cape Town running out of something else, or some other city being hit by a cyclone, or whatever it is. So we're saying there's a connection then between the everyday life of city working, what's happening in the global climate space, and what you're saying. Fine. So the thing is, it is very rare for young Indian scholars to participate in a process like this. Even very senior people don't have the opportunity because the system is exclusionary. We don't think it's really interesting, and it's a lot of time. And there are very few institutions here that can create the space for you to go out and actually do it. But the fact is, if you do not publish in this, and we had a very interesting challenge, because when we were defining the next cycle in Addis Ababa, we had one of India's most senior climate scientists, and I was telling him, I said, look, one of the most important phenomena in the world of climate science is something called the monsoon. We all experience it. But there's very little research done on the monsoon. Why? Because much of the climate science is done in countries that are cold and in the north. But the monsoon actually affects 1.5 billion people from China all the way through, South Asia to East Africa. And just to get the word monsoon into the outline of that chapter, or at least the report, took 3 days. But part of that was because, as an Indian scientist, he was hesitant to stand up and say, look, you guys don't know what you're talking about. This is really important. And we don't have the science to do this. So what I'm saying is, participation in global debates and engagement and publication is also important, because these things feed back, we influence them, they influence us. And unless you're in that space, you can't actually change things. Doesn't mean that you have to be a victim of that space and capitulate and whatever, to do Shashrang Pranam and all that kind of stuff to that system, which is what we do in some senses. We have to be able to resist and actually change that, not only for ourselves but for everybody in the world. And that's where those connections are between everyday life and, in one senses, hopefully taking off from Gautam Ghosh, etc. People will be writing good fiction about climate change, and then that will actually get across to people and say, oh my God, this is actually happening, this is what's going to change us. That's what actually changes people's real lives, and that will be backed all the way through op-eds into actual science. And in 5 or 10 years, you'll actually find a whole body of literature or a genre of literature around climate, because it's got to do everything about us. It's like science fiction or noir or something like that. It's something that connects all of these things, and you will have the full spectrum. I thought I took a little time to go over that, because I think making these connections across different levels and processes is really important, and we need to struggle to find the spaces to take them over and then change the conversation around, both as individuals, as academics, as citizens, as activists, because if you don't change it, then I think a lot of these things are about ideas and practices. Thank you.
Thank you all for very different, very interesting perspectives. So what I'm going to do now is open up for questions, and maybe we'll take one round, a set of questions, and in responding, if you guys also want to reflect on each other's perspectives a little bit, that would be nice as well. So, questions, comments? Anyone?
So, thank you everyone. It was really informative to sit here and listen to all of you. My question is around Bhasha and the creation of not just concepts but also alternative vocabularies for the multiplicity and the diversities that the Global South has. So, and how to push those. One is that, and the second is that how the Global South in itself will at some point become a center, and how it creates relational peripheries. I mean, for that matter, the masculinity that is there in the Global South. So how does it create relational peripheries, and is the process of Global South and the Southern theory in itself a challenge, and the creation of those peripheries, and like a cycle that is going to continue?
Should we take a couple more and then get people to respond? So I actually have one. I mean, I think just thinking a little bit both about the politics of knowledge, but also the politics of dissemination. I was wondering if you could, from thinking about global processes all the way to, vernacular language processes, how to think about sort of questions of access, about particularly of circulation and of sort of moving of writing from different forms. So, like you were saying, Professor Gundur, from writing in academic literature to op-eds or to Wikipedia to more kind of different digital forms of writing as well, and dissemination, and to think a little bit about how maybe we can do more of that, or how we can enable more of that to happen, whether through translation or other forms of media.
I wasn't prepared. So I think I'm kind of drawing both on what you were asking and your question as well. I mean, and definitely what you were talking about is kind of how the politics of citation can really enable and facilitate this kind of balance, right? This kind of so I think Sarah Ahmed's work, I don't know whether you're familiar with, about kind of feminist citation, because, and trying to just cite as many women as possible, because traditionally, especially in some fields, as you were saying, women are much more or much less cited. So I think that's quite an easy way to just alert, especially when we're teaching, to students, to ensure that if you're reading something, to see whether there's similar writing about something that might not be that well known, but to kind of look to see if it's by a woman of color, etc. And I think that kind of brings me to this idea, and one of our biggest challenges, I think, in Indian academia that I touched on briefly, is kind of intersectionality and who and which kind of knowledge systems get represented. And of course, if we're talking about a kind of parity in knowledge systems, both, say oral traditions, and we're going to be talking about this in the next session as well, but oral traditions, written forms of making, etc., then how do we disseminate those all on a similar platform? And I think this is where digital actually has a lot of potential, where you can put different forms of knowledge next to each other and kind of give them that legitimacy because they exist in a, say, digital journal. And the last thing that, kind of maybe touched upon a little bit what you were saying is about experiments in form digitally. So a few colleagues of mine in the US have been writing a book on digital methods in historical work, and it was written in public. So it was basically 3 authors who were, I mean, kind of almost like using, they weren't blogging, but they were using a kind of blogging platform where they were writing and doing their drafting, everything in public, which is terrifying as well. I mean, as you were saying, I mean, your writing gives you that comfort of, you know, kind of being able to make mistakes as well, but it's also fantastic because it opens up the conversation in ways that, you know, we can't possibly know because, you know, you have an international audience feeding back on, you know, as you were saying, your 8,000 kind of comments. I mean, that kind of thing becomes possible. So I think, you know, that's at least one way I feel like digital can maybe help. And of course, machine learning and its relationship to translation, because so many of our conversations in this country are not mediated unless it's through English, and I think that's a problem. So.
I just wanted to make a point about, you know, because we are talking about Bhasha and subaltern. So one question also looking outwards, the question of language, and I say this in relation to your question about the global south. You know, for instance, how many scholars in India speak Chinese? Our engagement even with the broader Asia. And this relates to Aromar's point about, you know, if we are looking, we do look to the West, we do look to English as a kind of, you know, the North. And I think it's time to think otherwise. Even today, the institutional spaces, the resources, the infrastructure, I mean, it's kind of appalling. Like I'm told, I think in China, the Xinhua has 1,000 fluent Hindi-speaking, you know, staff to begin with. And I think somewhere if we need to come together, we need to also open up, look outwards, you know, in our, you know, surrounding to kind of get a sense of, you know. And the other question that is kind of related to what Professor Guntur said, but also, you know, one thing, I don't know, I'm just teaching since a year now back in academia in India, the question of how reading and writing in itself is quite under threat in some ways in a generation that is much more used to digital spaces. And I talk coming from a private university with, you know, it's not the challenge of the, you know, other kinds, but there is that question that we need to grapple with also. It's very real.
Yeah, I see the problem is the question of dissemination and even the gender problem. Even my wife used to ask me, you don't read any female philosophers. That's why since last year I have been reading Hannah Arendt. Finally I found. So, but the point is things are slightly different nowadays. Okay, even here see gender bias. We are minority, sir.
Should be.
Yeah, it's good. The question of dissemination, actually there are several spaces, you know, available to disseminate our academic work or intellectual work to reach. But the challenge is something else. Even I was thinking, this Google doesn't allow us to think. It trains us to search. So the question is not of dissemination. So there are different kinds of enemies, you know, and I agree with you. This question of reading and writing, probably this digital society is going to lose those critical reading and critical writing skills, I think. And if I have to talk myself, I have started reading less and watching Zizek on YouTube. You know, it's a different kind of, I don't know what are the consequences of this. I think we need to think about these possibilities.
I think, I mean, this is my own reflection, it's not based on any serious social science. We are at a very interesting moment in his history. We are actually an oral culture in transition. So unlike, you know, people in the 20th century in North America and Europe who went through the process of being, you know, made literate and the expert distinction, you know, object, subject, etc., we actually have the opportunity of being both tribal and sort of alienated at the same time. And that's a very interesting place to be. So I think we have the opportunity of not saying this or that, but both those things. So we can do exactly what you're saying. You can embrace the YouTube world, which is also a search world in some senses, and you can you can embrace an oral tradition, which is the way that lots of things actually translate. So the oral tradition in our context in India is something that really enables all the intersectionalities and the nuances we're talking about. Even the structure of language. I mean, Hindi itself is a huge matlab Bhandara, which has got so many different layers to it, which are continually changing, of which Urdu is just one part, etc., etc., etc. So I think holding on to the oral tradition and trying to bring that into engagement with digital processes is a very interesting thing. Plus, of course, we also have the largest population of people who are new literate, and that's the reason why our newspaper audiences are growing massively, unlike in other parts of the world. So we have the ability to translate between these different sort of registers, I think is very important. And the practical thing for that is that we have to privilege academic to be able to work across those, which means that the way that we decide on promotions, what is important, etc., has to enable that to happen. Otherwise, why would people do that? नहीं तो ना आपको assistant professor से associate professor का वो promotion नहीं मिलेगा, क्योंकि API score में somebody else has bought a paid article in something and you're writing something very interesting which people like and changes perceptions, but it doesn't work at all. So I think it really is in the structure of the academia, and we have to change that, and that's not very easy to do. But I think collectively maybe there's some ways to try and do that, and understand that heterodoxy and this diversity and these intersections are very important. We can't talk about the city in history and the link to the university without doing that. It doesn't work. That's the lived experience, so why should it not be part of the academic discourse and practice? The challenge is that we're still using, like our universities, we're using a 19th and early 20th century model to engage with, and that's what we contest here. We contest the high Baroque university, which is Oxford and Cambridge, etc., and we contest the Humboldtian frame, which went from Germany to the United States, and we say that doesn't work for us. हमारे लिए तो काम नहीं करता ये सब. We have to build something different.
Alright, unfortunately I'm going to close the session, but